I would say the fact you asked the question shows the success so far of the COVID consensus in imposing a single narrative. I mean, yeah, it's not about being neglectful of healthcare. Nobody accused people who wrote pandemic preparedness plans prior to 2020 of being not caring, neglecting healthcare. Nobody accused them of that. That was the scientific method. That was what was deemed to cause the least amount of harm to society as a whole. So I think it's about focusing on risk. And here we have to go back into things like, why did government media suggest this was something that everybody was equally at risk from, when that was patently not the case?
Milan ou Tripoli, Vilnius ou Benghazi, Paris, Moscou, on fait le bunga, bunga, Bangkok ou Bogota, Le Caire ou Jakarta, Gustavia, on fait le bunga, bunga.
Hello listeners, welcome back to BungaCast, the global politics podcast at the end of history, with Philip Cunliffe, hello.
Hey.
George Hoare.
How's it?
And myself, Alex Hochuli, hello. We are here to talk about COVID. Now, you may not want to hear about COVID. You may not want to talk about it. Many people are trying to brush that whole nasty episode from 2020 to 2022 under the carpet for reasons understandable as well as reasons very ignoble. And yet, books have started to come out discussing what exactly happened and asking questions. And this is very important. And it's important to do so that those in power can be held to account, as well as to understand what happens when and if there's another pandemic. So today you will hear me speaking to the authors of a new book called The COVID Consensus by Toby Green and Thomas Fazi. Just to tell you who they are. Toby Green is a historian of inequality, past and present, and with a specific focus on West Africa. And Thomas Fazi is a journalist and writer. They're both authors of The COVID Consensus. And Thomas Fazi, you may have heard on this podcast way back in episode 38 on the economics of exit. To tell you just a little bit about the book, there was a first edition that came out, which was authored exclusively by Toby Green, and a second edition, which has come out in January of this year, which is with Thomas Fazi, which vastly widened the scope of the book, and you'll hear a little bit about that when you hear the interview. Guys, you've recently been in in-person discussion with some of these authors, right?
So I attended the book launch for the book, and it was in late January at King's College in London. But they also had a great panel. They had a great lineup, including some key signatories of the Great Barrington Declaration and another King's College academic who's done work on kind of racialized medical policies around ethnic minorities. And so there was a great book launch, and not least because there was an interesting kind of conversation on the panel among the the kind of Great Barrington signatories, or some of the leading lights behind it, kind of looking back retrospectively on what it was all about, as well as then Toby and Thomas taking questions from the audience, some of which were fairly kind of pointed, and pushing them on some of the arguments that they've made elsewhere. And so it was a very good discussion. And it was also just, it was good to cohere people around criticism of something that has been, up until recently at least, so tremendously kind of policed and consensual in terms of the range of acceptable opinion.
Yeah, I mean, the COVID consensus, yeah, very much so. I think this has been the position. And yeah, just quickly to add to that, I mean, I saw both of us, Phil and I, were at a conference in Queen Mary, University of London back in June, where Toby and Thomas presented on some of these ideas, which form some of the key arguments of the book. So yeah, a counter-consensual take on COVID, and I think a really important one.
And just to say, I mean, it was Sunetra Gupta and Jay Bhattacharya, who's they're both kind of public health specialists in different places. Sunetra in London and Jay Bhattacharya in Stanford, and they were the two people who were important kind of signatories of the Great Barrington Declaration, and they were there as part of the panel discussion for the launch of the book. Just to be clear to listeners as to who I was referring to.
Okay, so you're about to hear my interview with Thomas and Toby. The second half of the interview will be available only for patrons as usual. That's at patreon.com/bungacast. We hope to see you there. And if you like what you hear, make sure you follow us and review us wherever you get your podcasts. See you in a bit. All right, I am here with Thomas Fazi and Toby Green to talk about their new book, The COVID Consensus. Hello, both. Thank you so much for joining us.
Hi.
Thanks
Great
for
to be
having
here.
us. It's a pleasure.
So your book obviously talks about something which has become, as the title alludes to, a consensus. And I think to the extent that even people who are critical treat it in such a sort of factual manner, and it's so consolidated as a fact that it's difficult to imagine that things could have been otherwise. I myself am a little tired of talking about COVID after, as I think many people are. So I congratulate you authors on this book for asking some hard critical questions when I think a lot of us don't want to ever have to look back. So just to get started, a very basic and potentially dumb sounding question, but what is lockdown? Because that is the central issue in the book. It deals also with vaccinations and other matters of the pandemic, the origin of the disease, and so on. But the lockdown is the sort of central question. So I ask, what is lockdown? Because over the course of the pandemic on this podcast, we had a number of debates about it, and often it was an issue that people are talking at cross purposes, and they have in mind different sorts of measures depending on where they are, even across different US states, let alone across different nation states or regions of the world. So there's a variety of measures, from simply closing some businesses or preventing large indoor gatherings to mandating everyone stay at home unless they are officially allowed to leave by the state. So what do you mean by lockdown?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question, if I can jump in. I think, because the first thing to be clear on is that in the medical terms, it's a new concept. And that's very important. We talk about in the book how it's a concept which actually comes down out of the closing down of prison facilities in the United States in times of rioting. That's where the word comes from. So it has actually, its etymology is interesting because it comes out of a carceral context. And actually, I think it's interesting it's instructive to actually look at what the word, how people describe it in other languages. So Spanish, French, confinamiento is confinement. And that actually hints at what lockdown should be, or as a concept, which is a quarantine. Quarantines are historic, have been used historically, and of course that's very important. But the fundamental difference with the lockdown was that it moved out of that historic usage, which was for local outbreaks of disease, and became a unilateral measure directed by the state and entire regions where there were no COVID infections at all, for example, as is the case. Somebody I interviewed for a podcast with Collateral Global in Angola, a colleague there said, there were whole areas being put into confinamiento, which had no COVID cases whatsoever. And that's historically new. That's very new. So it's a historic measure of quarantine, and the other and we can debate also the applicability of this measure to the particular type of disease that COVID has been. That's another issue. But that would be my starting point, and it's instructive to look at the different words in different languages, I think, to understand its roots. Thomas, I don't know, what do you?
Thomas, do you have a kind of definition of what you're talking about when you say lockdown?
Well, yes, of course, lockdown has come to mean different things in different contexts. In the context of the pandemic, I would generally understand lockdown as meaning the essentially the quarantining of healthy people, and I think maybe even more in general, the idea of society-wide non-pharmaceutical interventions. I think that would be probably the most blanket definition for lockdowns. The idea that a respiratory virus can be contained, controlled, and ultimately eliminated through the pursuit of various forms of society-wide measures. I would say the most widely used have been the quarantining of healthy people, and in some cases the quarantining of pretty much the entire population. That has happened in varying degrees. But I would say, I mean, that's what most people don't understand lockdown to mean. And the closing down of businesses is kind of an inevitable consequence of that. So I would say, I mean, this is the most, as Toby was saying, I think this is, regardless of how you specifically define or what you specifically understand lockdown to mean, I would say it's this novel idea of addressing a respiratory virus through, or any form of virus or a pandemic more in general, with these blanket society-wide measures. This is something that was really completely unprecedented pre-COVID, and in fact, it went against every pre-2020 pandemic plan that had pretty much ever been drawn up by national governments or even by the World Health Organization itself. All previous plans were aimed at minimal disruption possible, minimal societal, minimal economic disruption. And instead, so lockdown is kind of, it's a complete, turnover of that concept, of that logic. Instead, it's the logic that all of society has to be mobilized at every level in order to fight a virus. I mean, that's what that's I think is probably a good understanding of what lockdown as a general concept has come to mean, I think, in the context of COVID. But as I said, it didn't really exist before that.
Yeah, there's an important ethical dimension as well to the word. Many words are descriptive, but contain moral value judgments attached to them. And in the case, this idea that, that was said often about this time last year, actually, around lockdowns, when Anthony Fauci of the National Institute of Infectious Diseases, Allergies and Infectious Diseases in the US was going to congressional committees to discuss lockdowns. And he said, well, we never had a proper lockdown. China is having a proper lockdown now. And the implication of that was that that there was a value judgment attached to that, which is China is taking this seriously, and China is doing what's necessary to, as Thomas said, the link between lockdown and disease eradication. The idea that this was, and that was a moral value superior to visiting dying people in care homes, allowing children to play and socialize and move on into the world. So there was a value judgment attached to the word of lockdown.
Yes, okay, so I mean, just to I think it's useful in the book how you phrase it as open-ended national lockdowns, and that might seem like a banal phrase, but I think in the context it's useful in that it distinguishes them from quarantines, which obviously refer to 40 days, which is time delimited, and the lockdowns were open-ended time-wise as well as national in their extent rather than local. And I think that's important. It still leaves open the question, I guess, of what specific measures we're talking about, because in the book you at times seem sympathetic to measures that Sweden took, which limited large gatherings and so on, which under the definition you've proposed might be considered a lockdown as well, or even to a certain extent you seem sympathetic to what was initially pushed by Neil Ferguson in the UK, who was responsible for a lot of the ultimately incorrect modelling on which these policies were based, but where he proposed something which was a step less than the full lockdown that the UK eventually suffered. So maybe I'm being pedantic, but just for the sake of clarity, what kind of measures specifically are we talking about? I mean, what level do you set a lockdown? What specifically are you being critical of?
I think one of the things that certainly, and I think Thomas put this very well, we're being critical of the unilateral application of a particular concept the first point is that whatever, the model, and as you imply in your question, there's a kind of continuum there. If you read Mark Woolhouse's book, The Year That the World Went Mad, he says, the fundamental crime was lockdown. But actually, if you read the book, he supports a lot of restrictive measures up until that final lockdown. He says, that was a mistake. So there is kind of a continuum there. And people, as is often the case with, very sustained arguments, are actually sometimes talking about slightly different things. But what we can agree on is what Thomas said, is that fundamentally there is this continuum of measures. You might be more extreme or less extreme, but which fundamentally are designed to shut down society with the stated aim of eradicating a disease, and that you will do what it takes to do that. That may include at some point shutting schools, it may include shutting businesses, it may include making people not able to go out of their house for exercise except for once a day, and even if they sign a piece of paper in Spain to show, as in France, to show what they're doing. So there's a range of things within that, but that is the fundamental aim. And the fundamental thing that whatever you think of that model is certainly a Western biomedical model. And, the internationalist part of the book is showing, that the idea that this model is going to be applicable in all circumstances all around the world is an incredible act of scientific hubris. It's unscientific, takes no account of how disease spreads. It takes no account of the social conditions of people in poor countries. How they live their lives, the economic frameworks, what it will mean. It takes no account of any of that. And it fundamentally shows the way in which science is actually socially embedded. And so our fundamental criticism is also the way in which that aspect was completely ignored from any of the debate. So I think those would be our critiques, really.
Yeah, and I'm very excited to talk to you guys about that specifically in just a bit. But I wanted to continue this discussion right now about the ways that lockdowns were rolled out. So, one question of mine is whether the motivation for these open-ended national lockdowns that were put in place at a certain point with the idea that they would remain in place until vaccines became available. And that ended up being the case eventually. Was that a result of a fear that the death toll might be too large, or that the socio-political consequences of a large death toll would be devastating, whether socially or to the legitimacy of those states that had failed to impose these measures?
Well, I think that's definitely one way of understanding why the Western, and not just the Western political classes, did what they did. But I think that's kind of also letting them off the hook. I think this is what we could frame as a responsible left critique of lockdown. And so this idea that yes, lockdowns in hindsight were probably a mistake, didn't achieve their stated aims. But at the same time, they were the result of panic, of the governing classes really, not knowing what to do in the face of this completely unprecedented event, and so this is what led them down the road of lockdowns to avoid what the political fallout of a massive death toll. This is one way of understanding these policies, but I think putting it all down to panic and unpreparedness, I think is a bit of a simplistic explanation for what happened, because this, I think if we had seen these measures being rolled out in one country, I think this explanation would make sense if we had seen different responses in different countries. And so you could say, some countries panicked and went for lockdown, other countries panicked and did something else. If it was all the result of panic and confusion and governments not knowing what to do, I think we would have seen a diversity of responses as well. Instead, when you look at how harmonized, with differences, but generally, especially in the West, how harmonized these policies have been, everything points to a certain level of coordination, in fact, and the idea that certainly governments were being pressured by certain international organizations, by certain very high-profile international figures, philanthropic figures, the WHO and other organizations that were clearly pushing for these, for these policies. And so there clearly was pressure, a lot of pressure being applied on governments, but at the same time, where was that pressure coming from? Was that just, did that pressure just emerge as a result of, again, maybe, was it just a set of, was the media just, doing clickbaiting and trying to ramp up, people's fears, and did that in turn cause governments to react the way they did? Again, I think that's part of what happened, but I think when you look at how these policies were rolled out quite uniformly across countries, this does point to the idea that there was some degree of planning, there was some degree of coordination, and there was some degree of understanding that was the direction that we should head in.
I was just going to say, I think you put it really well, and I think it's interesting to take. This is the second edition of the book. The first edition I wrote very, very fast in 4 weeks, and it's interesting to look at the different points at which these editions have been published. So the first edition went to press in February 2021, so less than a year after the beginnings of the lockdowns. And at that point, and Thomas and I, we've talked about this, it was still possible to think, to attribute this to panic. There was a panic response. People didn't know what they were doing. They rushed into this route, and this was the outcome. But as the vaccine rollout then took shape, I think that became harder and harder to sustain. Because again of the fact that fundamentally when we talk about panic we think people didn't know what to do, but as we show in the book, Thomas, you've done a fantastic job I think in really bringing that to the second edition, making it such a different book than the first one. But actually people have been preparing for pandemics for years. The WHO had published a report on what to do about pandemics 3 months before the lockdowns began. And in November 2019, there was a whole pandemic preparedness tabletop known as Event 201, where very important organizations, the WHO, the World Economic Forum, came together. And, the idea that people didn't know how to respond, given the amount of preparedness which was taking place, doesn't make any sense at all. That's just not a starter. So then we have to look for
the idea of sorry.
Now go ahead, Thomas.
So I mean, the idea that this, that they basically ripped up their own rule books, I think has been reasonably widely discussed, but it certainly deserves repeating, as you do very well in the book and in detailing the way in which these plans were abandoned. But I think a lot of also with the discussion that was had around the time and throughout the pandemic was the lack of preparedness. Right. So that not only did they rip up their plans, but that the lack of state capacity stood exposed in many Western countries and kind of to a certain extent upended those tables, just in terms of whether you want to.
If I can just say, and then I'll let Thomas.
Hospital beds and so on.
No, I'll just get Thomas. I mean, there was a lack of preparedness for this plan. That was what there was a lack of preparedness for. There was a lack of preparedness for this plan because it hadn't been conceived before. And that was why people then panicked. Because nobody prepared for this and didn't know how to face it. But there wasn't a lack of preparedness. Yes, austerity and the impact on health services has to, be given, given its due, and that clearly had a major impact on what happened. But at the same time, I've spoken to very senior people who were involved with the pandemic response in the UK, who said, and have been involved in pandemic preparedness for many years, and said, they used to think that a standard potential outcome of a serious pandemic in the UK was 300,000 deaths, and that was how it would be. And so the idea that that was baked into, that was the policy in this. So what happened was people weren't prepared for what happened. They were prepared for pandemic.
Yeah, I mean, how do you explain the emergence of a massive push for something that's not only has it never been implemented before, it's never even been conceived of before. So again, it's hard not to see that some level of preparedness again and preparation for an event like this. One doesn't have to go as far as saying, this was an entirely planned. And so the appearance of the virus itself is part of the plan. But what we do know, simply because that might be the case, but we have no evidence for with no hard evidence for that. And so when it comes to the origin of the virus, there's still a lot of confusion, even though we know that certain avenues were of investigation were suppressed. So we have, so that's an interesting aspect, but we don't know for sure how this virus came about. But we do know, as Toby was saying, that they've been preparing for this for an event like this for a very long time. I mean, the idea of biological warfare and bioterrorism has been the main focus of security and defense planning and and drawing up of scenarios for a very long time. In fact, since 9/11, and so various responses had been drawn up. And if you look at the several of those scenarios really do do hark they have a lot of elements in common with what actually happened with COVID. So if you look at the 2010 Rockefeller report on where they envision different scenarios for a global pandemic, they have one of the scenarios is almost exactly what happened in 2020. And so they imagine that China goes for very, very harsh measures, and then other Western countries copy those measures, and those measures are in fact quite well accepted by society. And in fact, they imagine that would end up making these newly authoritarian measures kind of permanent. And of course you have also the event that was hosted
Event 201.
At the end of 2019, event 201, which was hosted by the World Economic Forum and the Johns Hopkins University, and they also imagine a scenario very, very similar to what actually happened. A global pandemic that breaks out in China, and they consider various measures that should be implemented, and a lot of the measures that ended up being implemented, were discussed on that occasion, such as the full spectrum control of information online and offline, and so on.
With one exception, which was the word lockdown, and that's very interesting and instructive. That the word lockdown doesn't appear in the Event 201 framework, and there's quite a lot of evidence that to show that this was a novel approach in that sense. Coming back to this idea of how new was this? It wasn't included in the Event 201. The word doesn't appear once in the November 2019 WHO report, not once. And we interviewed the lead author of that report for the book, who said that the report was based on the state-of-the-art literature. Didn't use the word lockdown once. So that's really strong evidence that this was an entirely new response.
And again, I think that what you mentioned just very briefly, Alex, on how lockdowns ended up, being very tightly correlated to vaccines. I think that also points to the fact that this was part of I think we can't analyze these aspects of the pandemic management in isolation. So I think the lockdowns have to be understood as something that was necessary also to pave the way to the politics of the policies of mass vaccination that came afterwards. I mean, I don't think you can understand the latter without the former. And so I think that also points to this having been part of a sort of a more long-term plan that did include as kind of an endpoint the mass vaccination of societies, which would have been very, very hard to implement without the argument that was the way out of lockdowns.
It's interesting that you started at talking there, Thomas, about a lot of the kind of planning around this had been around issues related to bioterror, and it's interesting then that the eventual lockdown that emerges and the various, albeit different forms of lockdown, but ultimately all lockdowns across the majority of states in the world, end up having this repressive and sort of totalizing aspect to them, which one would imagine from a response to some widespread bioterror, which is rather different to, I think one would imagine in response to kind of health threat, which is much more, I guess, agentless, right? It doesn't have an obvious agent behind it. So I find that interesting, and it might be worth at this stage to, if you wouldn't mind telling us a little bit in narrative terms, how the lockdowns came about, reminding us, because I think it's useful to tell that story in terms of trying to get to an answer which you guys provide in the book, as to why lockdowns became generalized across the majority of states, and how it went from an unprecedented measure to one which became the default, and one which it was very hard to think of alternatives other than to say, no, I don't want this and it shouldn't be done. And I think that's indeed part of the problem of the debate around it, which is an issue we might get to later on.
I mean, if perhaps I could just say something about the first part of your comment there, Alex, and then Thomas, having lived it through Italy, you're probably better positioned to do the narrative part. But I think the question of how this seems almost a militarized response is very important, because, of course, it was a militarized response. That is the fundamental issue. And why was it a militarized response? Well, as you mentioned, the relationship between fears around bioterror and the security establishment, and this is a public health issue. But actually what we know, and we mention in the book in several places, is that the security establishment, particularly in the United States, have been very heavily involved in funding research into this kind of area for a long period of time. And we should also recognize that the security establishment had been very heavily involved in the kind of biopharma industrial complex since the era of the Cold War. The development of the vaccine industry in the 1960s and 1970s was very closely connected to Cold War technologies and the Cold War. So this is not actually a new relationship. This, I'm speaking perhaps as a historian here. This is actually an old relationship. It shouldn't really surprise us, but it's a very important part of it.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So what, of course, the first moment we start to hear about lockdown is when Wuhan goes into lockdown, and then the wider region of Hubei goes into lockdown. And that's the first time that the term kind of enters the media and the political discourse. And it's interesting to see how the initial responses, even of most media outlets, were of shock, surprise, dismay, and even quite harsh criticism of the Chinese measures. And in fact, we see reports in the Western media of the extreme lengths that the Chinese authorities are going to keep people inside their homes. We had reports in the media of authorities kind of welding people inside their homes and tracking them with drones all the way up into solitary mountainous areas, and so the reaction is one of surprise. And in fact, there's also quite widespread skepticism of the efficacy of these measures. And various health experts that were interviewed in the very early days of the Wuhan pandemic were very skeptical, if not outright critical, of these measures. They were simply repeating what was the consensus up until that moment, which was that these measures were unlikely to succeed in killing, in kind of eradicating the virus, and were highly likely, in fact, to cause to have health, to cause a number of unintended consequences, which might turn out to be very negative. And in fact, that that was the consensus up to that moment, and so that reaction was understandable. And what we see is that narrative starts to shift, very almost overnight, really. And of course, Italy plays a crucial role in that respect. I mean, Italy, like all countries, it went from having a kind of a dismissive approach towards the outbreak in China. Initially, there was a refusal to implement, for example, to stop flights from China and all that, and then almost overnight, the authorities go into full-on emergency response in Italy, and in response to flare-up of cases, a very localized flare-up of cases in northern Italy. They the Italian government decides to go for something utterly unprecedented, even more unprecedented than what had been done in China. And again, so when we talk of lockdown, there's always this people tend to compare the Chinese response to the Western response, which was harsher, which was more stringent, which was worse. And of course, there are various ways of understanding, but I think of course, some of the individual measures that China implemented, such as, for example, welding people inside their homes, is something we didn't see anywhere in the West. But at the same time, the scope the territorial scope of these measures that out of the blue Italy decides to implement almost from one day to another, and that is, the idea of a nationwide lockdown. That went far beyond what even China had done up till then, because of course China locked down, even if we consider the lockdown of the wider region of Hubei, in absolute terms that a lot of people live there, several million people, but in relative terms, relative to the population and to the wider economy of China, it's a very small region. I mean, it amounts to about 3% of the Chinese population. So, of course, the wider societal impact, the wider nationwide impact of those measures is going to be relatively contained, as it was. And, of course, deciding to completely shut down economic and social activity on the entire national territory, that's a completely different affair. And that's what Italy does. And Italy, and interestingly, it does it. It goes into lockdown the same day that the WHO declares the pandemic. And again, was this simply a coincidence? Or I mean, again, that does point to the fact that this had probably been in the talks for at least some well, I mean, it's not something that was decided that same day, I think, and so and I think, and that's what really changed everything. And of course, that then rapidly shifts the narrative across the rest of the Western countries as well. What had seemed inconceivable up until that moment suddenly becomes not only conceivable, but in fact, the only possible measure to go after the virus, to control the virus, and ultimately to suppress the virus and avoid an inconceivably high death toll. And suddenly, everyone's well, not everyone, but the entire mainstream media and most of the political establishment is suddenly, in several countries, is suddenly pushing for lockdowns as the only solution. And the pressure coming from the media, from international organizations, from figures like Bill Gates and others, is so strong that it actually forces even several governments to backtrack. And of course, the case of the UK government is an obvious example, but also Trump's U-turn is also another example. And so you see how that's when the response starts to get hijacked by the technocrats, which come to acquire even more power and control than politicians.
That's a very important point, because then you have this kind of 2-week period between March the 8th and March the 24th. So what happens? First of all, you have Italy going into lockdown, and the WHO is absolutely key, as Thomas says, because the WHO, although nobody had conceived of a nationwide lockdown, the report which the WHO published on February the 25th, 2020, after their visit to Wuhan, made it clear that they completely supported the Chinese authority in the measures that they'd taken, and expected every country where new cases were found to follow the same policy. So in a sense, that sets the ground rules for what happened then in early March. And then you have this kind of 2-week period where, first of all, most of the major Western European countries very quickly follow suit with Italy. The outlier is the UK and Sweden. And then March the 16th, Neil Ferguson, the Imperial College team, published this report about what will happen, projections of mortality with and without various measures, and predicts, and those predictions are very interesting and just show how unbelievable it is that what happened, because by the end of March, Ferguson's team was saying that one news report said that they predicted 5,700 deaths in the UK if the lockdown measures were followed. Well, as we now know, over 170,000 people have been said, are attributed to have died from COVID in the UK. And I know that team says, well, 20,000 people more died because they didn't implement it hard enough. However you look at it, this is an unbelievable failure of modelling projections on the efficacy of the lockdown, which also goes to show that they didn't know what the consequences of that would be and how effective it would be. So that's that starts happening on March the 16th. we know from the US that makes a difference in American policy, in the coronavirus task force, which has been set up. Senior figures there say that Ferguson's report made a difference. Within a week, the media pressure is such, as Thomas said, March the 23rd, Boris Johnson announces the UK is going to go into a lockdown. Now, that is very important because what happens the following week is that virtually, many countries in the global south follow Britain into lockdown. And I think the British lockdown was very instrumental in that because the next day, India entered a lockdown. Narendra Modi announced a lockdown. And we know that there had been no indication at all. I've spoken to many people in India. There had been no indication at all that was in the offing. He suddenly announced it. And that week, many countries in Africa went into lockdown too. So what we have is this process of, on the basis of a modelling report which predicted 5,700 deaths if the lockdown measures were followed, the rolling out of this policy which had such catastrophic impacts, as we show in the book.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's that's very kind of coherent narrative, and I think what happens afterwards doesn't have that much mystery, at least for me. I don't know about yourselves, but the sustaining of lockdowns once they had been agreed upon and they carried on for, let's say, until May, a certain amount of path dependency. Probably guarantees that they continue, as well as to a certain extent that elites discover certain political and potentially even economic benefits to maintaining the lockdown. So what I want to do is inquire a little bit more about the initiation of lockdowns and why they were decided upon and how there was such a degree of universality. I mean, not completely, absolutely universal, because there are some notable exceptions in terms of, for example, Sweden or Mexico or Brazil, for all different reasons, to different degrees, kind of buck the trend a little bit. But what I find interesting is whether the political motivation for adopting these lockdowns was not just following Italy, because I don't know how much of a model Italy actually served, as much as we'd like to just blame the Italians, wouldn't we, Thomas? The reality is that I wonder whether there wasn't some envy of China and a sense also of this rising power, and the degree of control that it can exert, the degree of direction it can exert over its own politics and polity, that led Western policymakers to think, actually, maybe we can do something similar.
Yeah, I think that's a very plausible analysis. We talk about that towards the final part of the book. In fact, how yes, there've been a lot of admiration growing of China, and of course a lot of business connections of all kinds between Western societies, and not only Western economies, but also the medical sector, even the publishing sector. Some of the top journals have offices in China, so there was an integration at various levels of elites with Chinese society, and so I think that that certainly has an important part to play. I think the other thing that we do talk about in the book is propaganda, and we know that there was propaganda around the severity of the virus in particular. These videos of people falling dead in the street, and all kinds of, there were various things like that which were then scrubbed from the internet. We don't know who was behind that. There's no evidence who was behind that, but we do know that it was there. And the attempt to remove it from the internet subsequently kind of suggests that whoever was behind it wasn't necessarily just some hacker somewhere. It suggests something a bit more coordinated, but we don't know more than that.
Yeah, I mean, did you put this down then? I mean, ultimately, I guess, because I mean, my default assumption is that it's a matter of imitation, which doesn't feel entirely satisfactory, but that basically leading states implemented this policy and just others went along with it, rather than coordination or even coercion. Ultimately, what do you put it down to? It's the title of your book, The COVID Consensus. How does it emerge?
Well, that's the whole point. I mean, the emergence of such a tight, coherent narrative across countries, especially across all major countries, does point to a high level of I would say, a certain degree of central coordination. And of course, it's that doesn't mean that there was a room somewhere with 5 people in it, which was deciding the global COVID response. But I think it's pretty clear when we look at the uniformity, the harmonization of the narrative across the mainstream media. the harmonization and the kind of micro control of the narrative on online media, on social networks. We now know, also thanks to the Twitter files, although a lot of us had, an understanding of what was going on, but we now know that there was, a very tight coordination between major states, first and foremost the US, the United States, and all major social media platforms to tightly control the narrative, even on these platforms, and to impose kind of the COVID consensus narrative on these platforms. We know the WHO played a crucial role in kind of acting as a middleman between these various actors right from the start. Already in February 2020, the WHO launches its anti-disinformation program, which aims to, which establishes basically, very sort of a control room with all the major social media networks and also all the major traditional media networks to impose, or to enforce, the dominant narrative. So again, we wherever we look, we do see a high level of planning and coordination, and I think, and again, we have to understand that in terms of, I would say, a confluence of interests. I think there were clearly economic interests at play. I think if we look at, the dominant fraction of capital today, and at least in Western capitalism, we find, clearly the IT sector, big tech, and the biotech and pharmaceutical sector. And clearly both sectors, which have been sitting for quite some time at the top of the kind of economic hierarchy of Western capitalism, clearly hugely benefited from the policy response, and it's and we have, and so it's easy to assume. I think it's natural to assume that they played a role in pushing for that response, because they had to benefit from it in a variety of ways, which they did. And in fact, we also see quite intense coordination between these sectors. We now know that, for example, Pfizer was in direct talks with Twitter XX, asking them to censor this or that or that person online, not necessarily because they were spreading misinformation, but simply because they were maybe putting out true information that went, correct factual information that went against the dominant narrative. And so we see quite a high level of cross coordination between these major sectors, which all had to benefit from the kind of let's lock down until the vaccines are ready response. But of course, as you mentioned, there were also political reasons for wanting to go down that path. I think Western elites have given up, trying governing through consensus, through kind of the traditional kind of post-war class compromise. I think now, we have seen an authoritarian turn in Western politics for quite some time, and and this use of fear. So the politics of fear have been an important aspect, I think, of Western politics for quite some time, at least dating all the way back to 9/11, and again, in all the scenarios that we've been talking about, it always came out, how a health crisis might have been a way to implement measures of social control that would have been otherwise very hard to implement. I think there were political reasons for go down that road as well.
I mean, there's this political side, which is obviously fundamental. We've talked about. And I think we also have to look at the question of, and we look at it in the book too, of the way in which people responded to it. Why did people accept this? And there are various reasons for that. It comes partly to do with, I think, the nature of, Thomas, you mentioned tech and the growing role of tech in our lives, in our consciousness. The idea that tech will provide the solution. That's something that we'd been, we'd accepted over the previous 5 or 10 years. Also, something we look at, the idea that actually surveillance, we accept surveillance as part of our daily lives. The Snowden affair had shown that very clearly. People have just continued signing up to the various apps. And, this, of course, the fundamental difference here was that surveillance was now a good thing. You were being a good person if you tracked and traced. And, so there was an ethical normativity which was given to actions which we had been participating in and tacitly accepting for quite some time, and relationships with the state, in fact, which we had been tacitly accepting for a long time, which I think is really significant in understanding why not only was there this political drive, but also why there was so much support around it to start with. That those two things are connected. And then, so as Thomas says, there is a sense of a dominant narrative which is being imposed here, constructed, a COVID consensus. And so as a historian, I spent most of my career trying to unpick dominant narratives. So and I think Thomas would say the same. So I think, that's one of the things we talk about in the book is also our kind of incredulity that people who we thought of as fellow travelers in that regard suddenly thought that the mainstream narrative was fine.
Yeah, so turning to the effects of lockdown, and I think we'll deal with, I guess, maybe what might be the harder case in the global north in just a second. But turning to the global south, it's surprising why that poor and middle income countries went along with lockdowns. My thinking that they should imitate Western countries is no surprise, and so much aid is tied up with them going along with various sort of directives and guidelines that it's not surprising that they should do the same here. But what's really remarkable, I think, is that a lockdown would be most damaging in poor and middle income countries where there's a high degree of informality, large proportions live in slums, and so on. And you dedicate a fair bit of the book to discussing these consequences. Why don't you just talk us through what precisely is the problem with the application of lockdowns in countries like these, and also why they adopted them?
Okay, yeah. I mean, this is quite incredible. I mean, so let's go back to 2014, 2015, Sierra Leone, Ebola. A 3-day lockdown was trialled. And Médecins Sans Frontières, for example, Doctors Without Borders, warned against it because it would lead to growing lack of trust in the medical authorities in a context where 85% of the African population works in the informal sector, gets money in the informal sector. Now, what that means is you have to move about. It's about taking goods to market. It's about movement. It's about working on share taxis. If you cut that down, people are suddenly effectively almost on the breadline straight away. For the book, I interviewed a colleague in Nigeria who said, everybody in Nigeria now agrees that, this policy will work for 3 days. Okay, so this was the kind of policy which, first of all, there's this question of the, enormous medical colonialism involved in just saying, okay, this policy, we'll just put it out everywhere. And then why doesn't it work biomedically? Well, because 1 in 7 of the world's population lives in slums. Think about Mike Davis's book, Planet of Slums. Okay, so what does that mean? Well, it means they're crammed in. So if you have put in a curfew, you're actually forcing people together. And this is a virus which circulates inside more than outside. And of course, most low middle income countries have got warm weather, and people spend in those situations much more time outside than inside because inside their living conditions are poor. So it's actually a counterproductive policy. And we can see that, for example, the case of South Africa. There's a fantastic book by Leslie Banks and Nelly Sharples on the case of South Africa, which has far and away the highest COVID death rates on the African continent, had one of the continent's most draconian lockdowns, and they effectively argue that because of the draconian lockdowns that this happened, alongside, by the end of 2020, almost 50% of South African businesses had gone bankrupt. I mean, it's quite extraordinary. So there are the biomedical implications, the fact that there's a different sociological environment, social environment, which means that viruses will circulate differently. Now, that shouldn't be rocket science to scientists, and the fact that in a nice suburban apartment in Geneva, this looks like a good idea for people living in a slum in Accra is quite it's pretty disgusting. So why did they get enacted? One of the things which is quite clear is that the countries, and I speak here for Africa, but the countries in Africa which imposed the most keenly were the ones who were most part of the Western geopolitical project. So South Africa, Senegal, for example, would be another good case. Countries which are very closely allied to broader geopolitical projects. And of course, the other important issue in the African context is that this was a policy which came out of China. And we know that China has a huge influence on the African continent as well. So all of those aspects make it very difficult to envisage how, people say, oh, well, African nations are sovereign. They didn't have to go along with that. But in all of these contexts, which I've just outlined, I think it's hard to imagine a counterfactual situation where the rest of the world, China, America, France, they decide this is the policy that everybody has to follow. And, Africa needs to say, well, actually, no, we decided it's not for us. It's quite hard to envisage that.
Yeah, I mean, it is remarkable. I think there might be a paradox here, though you might disagree with some of the presuppositions of this paradox. But that I had thought already early on in the pandemic that those places which would most benefit from a lockdown, to the extent that a lockdown would spare very limited healthcare capacity, lack of hospital beds, lack of medical equipment, and so on, are precisely those in which a lockdown would be most damaging, which is to say in poorer countries. Hello, listener. That's the end of the first part of the interview. For the second part, you'll have to sign up at patreon.com/bungacast. We do hope to see you there. That will also be followed by the after party, where we ask some probing questions about what we've heard. And remember, if you don't follow or subscribe to Bungacast, please do so now and drop us a review wherever you can. Bunga.